With the outbreak of war in Europe and the Far East, every corner of our empire must stand ready to answer the call of king and country. And nowhere is affection for His Britannic Majesty stronger than in the fabled lands of India. As our government's policy of Indianization takes root, the natives assume greater control over their destiny as we march together into battle against the foes of our common empire. The great breadbasket of our far-off empire happily keeps us in raw material, with enough food, cotton, and rubber to keep our boys fighting forever. No sacrifice is too great for victory. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian. When one thinks of British participation in the Second World War, images of Tommies in their Brodie helmets slogging through the dust of Egypt or charging the beaches of Normandy spring to mind. Others may picture the maroon braid boys of the airborne descending on Pegasus Bridge, or gentlemen spies like the late Sir Christopher Lee slinking through the shadows of occupied Europe. These images all have one thing in common, however. Their protagonists are universally Anglo-Saxon. In reality, the Second World War was a clash of empires. Empires who called upon all of their people to take up arms and fight for the survival of their dominion. For the British Empire, this included over 370 million people of India, their largest colony and a much-touted jewel in the imperial crown. In today's episode, we'll take a look at the Second World War from the perspective of the jewel rather than the head that wore it, and how this conflict realized Indian independence. The Type B cipher machine, codenamed Purple by the Americans, was Japan's version of the legendary Enigma machine. Unfortunately for Japan, the U.S. cracked Purple's encryption codes in 1940, giving them access to their military and diplomatic communications before the war in the Pacific even started. Thanks to the partner and sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, you won't need to worry about who's monitoring your online activities. Visit nordvpn.com/historyavn and find out how Nord protects you from man-in-the-middle attacks that can compromise free Wi-Fi networks and allow hackers to intercept your data, or crippling ransomware that allows bad guys to hold your data hostage. Our team makes extensive use of global instant messaging services to coordinate, so we're no strangers to cybersecurity risks. Nord tools like threat protection, which shields you from malware, trackers, and ads, and Dark Web Monitor, which notifies you if someone takes your credentials, help to keep us and our data safe. Support our channel and try NordVPN today with a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee, and get a 2-year plan and 4 extra bonus months. Simply sign up using our link in the description below, or visit nordvpn.com/historyvpn. The India of 1939 was a vastly different place than we know today. The British colonial government, or Raj, was a racially segregated and socially stratified body with a white ruling class held above the native Indian. The caste system assisted in maintaining social control. Whites-only businesses were common, and Indian people were even prohibited from entering certain districts of cities in their own country. Despite these prohibitions, a kind of Indian middle class developed, professionals who managed to work within the system to find some measure of security and prosperity. A young Gandhi belonged to this class as an up-and-coming lawyer. However, the vast majority of Indians were, to put it mildly, dissatisfied with the system. Perhaps sensing the rising tide of anti-colonial sentiment, the Raj began a policy of Indianization in the 1920s and 30s, which saw more and more native Indians placed in government and military positions. Of particular note was the introduction of Indian officers to the local military forces, which until this point had been under exclusively white command. These native officers were often placed in charge of all Indian units. While on their face, These reforms were billed as steps toward self-rule and Indian success. The reality was that they were token key cessions to silence nationalist rumblings, a way for the British to simultaneously mollify their critics and maintain control. Britannia rules the Indians as they rule the waves. This was, to the Rajah's mind, a fact. The Second World War would put this fact to the test. The fall of Poland in 1939 brought the infamous Sitzkrieg and 8 months of little change to the subcontinent. This gave the people of India time to reflect, time to begin seeing the war in Europe as a far-off matter, a news item that wouldn't touch their homeland. Like the United States, India was thousands of miles from Europe, protected by sea and desert, mountain and plain. Being in India was like being in a grandstand watching some game or other, according to British civil service officer Hay MacDonald. MacDonald's attitude was not a popular one, however. Many of his compatriots were firmly fixed on joining the coming fight. Thus, the British ordered the Indian Army mobilized at the start of the war in 1939, with Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, believing wholeheartedly that the Indian people would sign on in droves to fight for democracy and freedom, king and country. Indeed, one group of native Indians came flocking to the Union Jack, the wealthy Maharajas of the princely states. Within the structure of the Raj, roughly 1/3 of the native population was ruled over by Indian princes who administered fiefdoms in the empire's name. When Linlithgow called, the Maharajas saw an opportunity to shore up their power in the face of the rising Indian independence movement. The princes viewed Indian nationalism as an existential threat and hoped that by eagerly and vigorously supporting the British crown, their survival would be guaranteed in an independent India. Revolutions, even peaceful ones, are often unkind to the crowned heads. The princes raised battalions of infantry and artillery or funneled their wealth into the British war chest. Scores of princes writing 6-figure checks to the British Air Ministry and other departments. With their men and their money, these old royals hoped to preserve their preeminence in Indian society, be it under British rule or in a free Indian state. Average Indians were equally interested in the conflict, and public opinion was surprisingly varied over who was in the right. India at this time included a variety of ethnic and religious groups that did not always coexist peacefully. The cause of Indian independence sometimes ran along these religious and ethnic lines, and Hitler's idea of racial purity found willing adoptees in the militant wings of the Indian independence movement. Such Hitlerians included the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, Hindu nationalist group, who openly celebrated Adolf Hitler and his desire for racial purity, as well as his methods in obtaining it. Meanwhile, those Indians who favored the Allies found themselves increasingly frustrated with the British, who should have been their compatriots. While Indian politicians were anxious to defend their homes and promote their people's prosperity, the British showed interest in India solely as a well of manpower from which to draw colonial troops. Hopes of a new cooperation came in 1940, when the British and Indian governments reached an astonishing agreement. London would pay for the entirety of India's war expenses and flood the colony with investment. The British would foot the bill for recruitment and transport of Indian soldiers and bankroll sweeping infrastructure improvements. But London's generosity proved hollow. The British paid their debts with sterling credits, essentially government ayahs that forced India to front the actual money, devastating the Indian economy. When the British government enacted the Defence of India Act, granting government officials unlimited power to crack down on any sentiment, speech, or action they considered disloyal, the imperial government's priorities were spelled out. Focus on the war and keep India under political and economic control. While the British worked to consolidate control on the home front, Indian soldiers found their life in the field surprisingly varied. The social dynamics of some units were perfect mirrors of the Raj, with white officers enforcing a kind of de facto segregation. Disputes broke out over pay discrepancies between white and Indian officers of equal rank, the content of ration tins, and even whether radios should be tuned to Western or Indian musical stations. While this form of petty racially driven office politics was the rule in some units, others turned out to be surprisingly progressive for the era. A common rule for these units was the prohibition of speaking in derogatory terms in the presence of Indian officers about their political leaders, customs, traditions, or music, while others accepted their Indian peers of their own accord once they'd proven their mettle and competence in the field. This attitude began to work its way up to the lines, with the Infantry Committee penning a report midway through the war identifying segregation within units as a critical issue. The most strenuous efforts must be made to ensure that no discrimination of any nature is permitted. By the end of the war, 2.5 million Indians would fight for the British Empire, providing a critical component of the Allied forces that defeated the Axis powers that succeeded in bringing the war to India's doorstep. Imperial Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was like a bucket of icy water dumped onto India's head. Up till now, the people of India thought the Second World War would play out much like the First, with Indian troops sent to far-off lands, and the subcontinent spared of actual fighting. The Japanese were all too happy to disabuse India of this notion, and Pearl Harbor was followed by an East Asian blitzkrieg that toppled colonial government after colonial government. The Japanese carved a beachhead into India's neighbor, Burma, and seized Hong Kong, Singapore, and British Malaya. India, therefore, became a crucial staging ground for the Allies in the Pacific, and refugees fled the Japanese advance for the perceived safety of the Raj, a flow which only intensified after the Japanese captured the Burmese capital in March. By the end of the month, the Japanese had captured all of Burma and cut the critical overland supply route from India to China. Burma's fall opened India up to a direct Japanese invasion, with Bengal first on the block. Panic swept through this province in this desperate hour as their imperial subjects were racked with fear. The British Raj stepped in to restore calm by enacting a scorched earth policy that devastated the civilian population. Food stockpiles were seized by government forces, bridges were destroyed, civilian watercraft confiscated or sunk, waterways sabotaged. If the Japanese invaded Bengal, they would inherit a ruin. However, the Japanese had reached the end of their supply lines in Burma and were unable to advance in India, so they bombed it. As British soldiers sacked what they should have been defending and Japanese ordnance fell from the sky, the people of Bengal found themselves straddling a tightrope over the bottomless chasm of starvation. Fishermen had no craft with which to ply their trade. Farmers had no crops, nor way to get them to market if they did. In 1942, the ravening claws of hunger would snare India in their clutches. The Bengal famine had begun. The famine was a tragedy within a tragedy, an epidemic of hunger and disease that saw between 2 to 3 million people die. While the dominant narrative for some time has been that extreme weather was a leading cause of the tragedy, more modern research seems to indicate British policies in India as the chief cause of the famine. Indian-American scientist and journalist Madhuri Mukherjee posits that over-exploitation of Indian resources by British leadership directly caused the famine, with London continuing to pull tons of rice from India, even as leaders of the Raj begged for emergency food aid. Hordes of refugees from Burma poured into India, increasing demand for what food was available. Fungus devastated rice crops, severely limiting edible produce. British industrialists and landowners intervened, engaging in profiteering during the crisis. Freak weather devastated farmland and wiped out villages. And lastly, though not exhaustively, the Raj made great efforts to keep the famine out of the press, which prevented the possibility of international aid that could have saved lives. What is beyond debate is the devastating impact the famine had on the people of Bengal. The British inquiry into the famine noted a breakdown of family units as husbands deserted wives and wives, elderly dependents were left behind in villages. Babies and young children were sometimes abandoned. Historian Dr. Janam Mukherjee describes the hellscape that Bengal became. Corpses lay scattered over several thousand square miles of devastated land. 7,400 villages were partly or wholly destroyed by the storm. Cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases flourished. As the Japanese postured and people starved in the streets, social pressures began to mount. Politics in India did not stop with the declaration of war, and Indian nationalism only intensified as British administrators fumbled and fumbled again. The discussion was dominated by Mahatma Gandhi's Indian National Congress, drawn from the Hindu majority of Indians, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Muslim League, who feared becoming second-class citizens in an independent India. As time wore on, the Inc. began to emphasize Hinduism as a critical component to Indian society, leading to the Muslim League's Lahore Resolution, calling for separate Muslim and Hindu states. This marked the effective end of cooperation between the two, and Indian nationalists were driven into the arms of militant extremist leaders. These included pro-Axis forces such as the Indian National Army, led by Subhas Chandra Bose. Bose grew the INA to 43,000 members at its peak, rallying the disaffected Indians with his promise, "Give me blood, and I will give you freedom." The INA would go on to fight in Burma against the British, collaborating with the Japanese until the war's end. Other Indians chose less drastic methods of expressing their displeasure with the British. As numbers of British and American troops in India swelled, cultural clashes and outright crime ensued. American troops began slaughtering cattle held sacred in Hinduism, while allegations of sexual assault scandalized the Indian population. Gandhi and the Inc. responded by issuing the Quit India Resolution in August of 1942, a largely symbolic call for India to cease cooperation with the British until they guaranteed independence. The British responded by arresting Gandhi and many Inc. leaders, who they would hold for 3 years. Gandhi, even from prison, exhorted his followers to peaceful protest. Instead, the Indian independence movement chose violence. Protests in Bombay saw 33 people killed by police in the 4 days following the Inc. leadership's arrest, and a wave of attacks on government buildings ensued. The British cracked down hard, and 2,500 Indians were killed. The Raj ultimately succeeded in putting down the insurrection, and Indian independence would have to wait until the war was won. While the British fought the Indian people, the Japanese fought the Indian army. Indian troops managed to reclaim some of Burma in December of 1942, and the Japanese responded by bombing Calcutta for several days. Most of 1943 in India would be dedicated to reorganization and rearming of the Indian army, as the Japanese had taught the Raj a bloody lesson. They were not ready to face the Japanese in open battle. While troops in the subcontinent readied to defend their home, Indians abroad helped liberate North Africa before participating in Operation Husky, seeing action throughout Sicily. As 1943 drew to a close, the reinvigorated Indian army prepared to march against the Japanese. The Japanese watched the Indian revitalization with concern and decided they needed to once again launch a surprise attack to keep the initiative. In March of 1944, they enacted their plan, dubbed Operation Yugo, which saw intense fighting on the Burmese border. The Indians stood against the Japanese at the border towns of Imphal and Kohima. The determined Indians stood their ground against the Japanese invasion, and come July, their foe had no choice but to break off the attack. The Indian National Army under Bose fought in the Japanese attack, and along with civilian collaborators, rendered aid and comfort to the retreating Japanese. As the Allies gave chase to the Japanese and encountered these collaborators, they chose honey over vinegar, sending doctors and food supplies to the isolated villages that had helped the Japanese. In this way, they hoped to win the locals back to the Allied side, rather than punish them for collaborating. August brought an Allied drive deep into Burma, and the bloody and brutal campaign to liberate the country merits its own video. Regardless, May of 1945 saw the Indian Army successfully capture the Burmese capital. For India, the war was over, and the end could not have come soon enough. Food shortages were rampant, even after the official end of the Bengal famine in 1944, and basic necessities like cloth were in equally short supply. Demobilization meant an epidemic of unemployment, as war workers were unceremoniously laid off. Members of the INA were arrested and interrogated, but public outcry saw many of them spared prosecution. Some Indians saw the INA as a legitimate member of the independence movement, rather than Japanese quiz. Speaking of independence, the British agreed to discussions with Indian leaders regarding the possibility of Indian statehood, and released political prisoners as an opening gesture, including Gandhi. Independence soon became an inevitability, and Indian statehood talks opened. Tensions between Hindus and Muslims were a key issue of the negotiations, leading to an agreement to partition the colonial territory into the Hindu state of India and the Muslim states of Pakistan and East Pakistan, now known as Bangladesh. The results of these negotiations are outside the scope of our discussion today, but suffice to say the liberated colony would experience some growing pains. In terms of military dead, India lost 87,000 soldiers in the fight against the Axis, but accounting for civilian dead in the Bengal famine and other incidents, the death toll rises to a staggering 2.2 million at a minimum. The Indian economy was devastated by the war, despite being on the winning side, and the country remains economically troubled into the modern day. Nevertheless, India was able to throw off the shackles of colonialism, kicking off a wave of decolonization in the aftermath of the Second World War. It is no hyperbole to say that Indian troops and material were a substantial contribution to the total Allied war effort, a contribution paid for in the spilled blood and empty stomachs of those living on the subcontinent. Western history says that the Second World War began on September 1, 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. But the Republic of China had fought Imperial Japanese aggression for a full 8 years before the first panzers rolled into Poland, and China would spend the war riven with internal strife, even as they beat back the Japanese. Imperial Japan first brought conflict to China with the 1931 invasion of Manchuria. But this conquest did not satiate their colonial ambitions, and the empire thus began rattling the metaphorical katana around Shanghai in 1932. Before invading the Jehol province the following year. 1936 would see the Japanese and Nazi Germany sign the Anti-Comintern Pact, and Chinese dictator Chiang Kai-shek began courting German support for his internal struggle against the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, who were quickly winning the hearts and minds that his Chinese nationalist movement, or Kuomintang, could not. But ideological agreement did not bring peace. As the Japanese moved on the Sichuan province, even as the Chinese and Germans traded anti-communist messages, open war in China would break out following the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, where Chinese and Japanese forces on the outskirts of Peking exchanged fire after Japanese troops crossed into Chinese territory in a naked provocation. A full-scale invasion of the Republic of China ensued. The Chinese were horribly outmatched. The Republic of China fielded expansive numbers of infantry, with precious few tanks or artillery to support them, and scarcely a navy or air force. Journalist Du Zongyuan chronicled the struggles of Chinese troops. Each day they only got one meal, because the supply transport corps were so often bombed by enemy aircraft. But what I felt saddest about was that when our side withdrew, a lot of our seriously wounded brothers had no one to look after them. Please tell me, what are we fighting for? Finding both their backs to the wall, the Kuomintang and CCP would put aside their differences to form the Second United Front. Mao Zedong himself declared all political parties and groups in the United Front must help each other and make mutual concessions for the sake of long-term cooperation. But the newly christened War of Liberation against Japan would prove costly, and the United Chinese were driven into a desperate fighting retreat that lost the cities of Shanghai, Hangzhou, and Nanking, among others. The Japanese were brutal in their conquests, and Nanking in particular would devolve into a carnival of depravity as Japanese soldiers committed crimes against humanity, including the assault of Chinese women, slaughter of infants, and other horrors beyond comprehension. The Japanese campaign of atrocities in Nanking is well known. But the situation was grim even before Japanese forces breached the nationalist capital. Nanking was swollen with refugees who competed with locals for what scarce resources were available. The situation became so dire that in the Nanking Safety Zone, food aid began to only be doled out for payment of a token fee, though the poorest refugees were given red tags to mark them as in need of free food. Sanitation was non-existent, with waste littering the city and building up inside houses, with their soldiers marking up defeat after defeat and hope draining by the instant. The literal stench of war hung over Nanking. Zhu Qishang, a survivor who was 22 at the time, recounted the Japanese crimes. Soldiers came to round people up. After detaining us, the Japanese soldiers took the three of us to a riverside. The moment we reached the riverside, the other two were hacked to death with swords. One of them struck me with a sword at the back of my neck, causing me to fall to the ground instantly. Still conscious, I bit hard at the collar of the shabby overcoat I was wearing to hold my breath in order to feign being hacked to death. Besides the wholesale slaughter of general civilians, it is estimated that over 20,000 women were victimized by the Japanese within the first month after Nanking's fall. Obtaining an exact number is complicated by twin tragedy. Many women were killed following their assault, while still others remained silent about their ordeal until their last days. 20,000 men were executed on false charges of being Chinese soldiers, while 30,000 actual Chinese troops were executed after capture in flagrant violation of international law. But as the shattered, brutalized city of Nanking settled into the rhythms of occupation, in the Guangzhou newspaper, an article on April 1, 1938 read, "After occupying the government organizations, they spread out to conduct searches, wantonly slaughtering our civilians with shaved heads or other resemblance to a soldier were tied up without exception." The situation appeared bleak as regional warlord turned nationalist General Han Fuku ignored orders from Central Command and retreated from Jianan to preserve his forces. This led to the Japanese capturing of Qingdao in January 1938, resulting in Han's execution on January 24 by a now furious Chiang Kai-shek, with Japanese forces occupying the north of Shandong in March. The Yellow River Defense Line. Still, the Chinese put up a stubborn resistance, with reinforcements from Lai Zongren's army managing to humiliate the Japanese in the Battle of Tirzhuang. Meanwhile, Japanese atrocities had driven many Chinese into joining the fight, with the communists under Mao Zedong seeing a significant boost in volunteers for his Red Army, which grew from 50,000 to 500,000 over 1937 to 1938. By August, the Red Army were able to form the new Fourth Army and Eighth Route Army, which were incorporated into the Second United Front, commanded by Chiang Kai-shek. But Japanese victories in 1938 saw the Chinese pushed to their limits, resulting in a desperate scorched earth maneuver infamously known as the Yellow River Floods. In June 1938, nationalist saboteurs intentionally destroyed the Yellow River dikes in order to slow down the Japanese invasion. The resulting floodwaters displaced millions of people and caused massive destruction of homes, crops, and infrastructure. Tens of thousands of people died as a result of the floods, and the economic impact was felt for years to come. The flood also had significant military consequences, as it slowed down the Japanese advance and enabled the Chinese forces to regroup and strengthen their defenses. Ultimately, however, it only held off the Japanese for a time, as they eventually captured the cities Amoy, Fukao, Kaifeng, and Wuhan by the time nationalist forces had retreated to Chongqing in November. Prompted by Japanese brutalities, U.S. President Roosevelt gave the Chinese a Liberty loan of $25 to help with recovery efforts. British Burma also became a Chinese supply depot, with the legendary Burma Road providing overland transport of desperately needed supplies and material. Chiang Kai-shek accepted foreign support with suspicion and sought to exploit his Western backers for his own end. Despite their stance against Japanese aggression, the Kuomintang was far from a model of decency, and throughout the war, nationalist officials were notorious for embezzlement, ineptitude, and outright corruption, deficits that would drive the Chinese people into the open arms of Mao Zedong. 1939 would see the Chinese continue to lose territory, and in 1940, the Japanese consolidated their gains into a puppet state under ultra-conservative and anti-communist Wang Jingwei, who began pressuring the British to close the Burma Road. That same year, the U.S. applied soft pressure to the Japanese, embarking on limited iron and fuel embargoes that made their support of Chiang's republic inescapably clear. But as it gained support from without, the republic found itself facing an old enemy within. The Second United Front was an uneasy alliance, and the CCP grew increasingly impatient with having to take orders from the Kuomintang, who were aggravated in turn by highly successful CCP recruiting efforts in Free China. Chiang's goal was to unite the people together under his flag alone. 1941 would see the Second United Front collapse as the communist new Fourth Army fought Kuomintang troops in what both sides claimed to be a traitorous ambush of their forces by the other side. Regardless of who ambushed whom, 1941 would also see the Chinese begin to retake territory and turn the Japanese back in a defensive victory at the Second Battle of Changsha. The empire was dealt another blow when the U.S., Netherlands, and Britain ended their trade in oil, cutting Japan off from the world oil market. Enraged and economically cornered, the Japanese expanded their war of aggression, bombing Pearl Harbor and launching their East Asian blitzkrieg. The Sino-Japanese War was now truly part of the Second World War. January 1942 saw the Japanese finally succeed in conquering Changsha, and the Chinese defense became a scorched earth one-eye. As the Kuomintang and CCP withdrew, they burned bridges and stripped factories, with many workers carrying off equipment in hopes of setting up shop in free China. Some Chinese troops withdrew to British India, while others moved to reinforce defensive positions elsewhere in the country. The Japanese would end the year capturing the city of Lesho, which cut the Burma Road definitively. Japan's attack on the United States and invasion of East Asia topped off a major crisis within the Chinese resistance. Despite the resistance once again fracturing along party lines, both nationalist and communist forces continued to engage in frontline actions. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and propaganda campaigns against the Japanese invader. Kuomintang leadership attempted to resupply and reorganize troops with the help of American and British allies, although corruption within the nationalist upper circles led to friction with the West. American funds that had been intended for use against Japan were instead directed toward fighting communist forces who were gaining influence throughout southern China thanks to the guerrilla efforts of the rebuilt New Fourth Army under Commander Chen Yi. As 1943 dawned, the nationalists began rebuilding their forces in India, but not without struggle. 60–70% of inductees did not finish basic training, with the majority deserting, while a full 20% starved to death behind Allied lines. Over $100 million in material and aid given to them by the U.S. was siphoned off to prepare for an eventual conflict with the CCP after the war. Despite their travails, 4 divisions were successfully reformed in India and flown back to China, where 16,000 Chinese defeated 60,000 Japanese at the Battle of Chengda in the Hunan province. Progress was also made in Burma, with Chinese forces advancing in North Burma in late 1943 to besiege Japanese troops in Myakina. 1944 would see Chiang lobby for a joint offensive to reopen the Burma Road, growing tired of the need to fly in troops to India for every resupply effort, as Allied engineers pushed to build new supply lines across friendly territory. Chiang's forces achieved numerous victories, such as the capture of Mount Song in Burma around June 1944. However, efforts to reopen the Burma route were severely hampered by the launch of Operation Ichigo, a Japanese offensive designed to conclude the Chinese theater once and for all. As the Japanese continued to press Ichigo, the Chinese joined the multinational Burma campaign, an epic series of battles and sieges that ended with the country liberated and the Burma Road open once more. The fighting in Burma would carry China through the end of the war and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered as the Soviets invaded Manchuria, but the guns did not fall silent in the Middle Kingdom. The corpse of Japanese imperialism was hardly cold before the Kuomintang and CCP were once again at each other's throats. After the First World War, Japan gained preeminence in the Asia-Pacific region, winning support through their former Entente allies. Yet during the Second World War, Japan found itself fighting many of these nations. While this situation was often chalked down to imperial aggression, the subject of Japan's expansion is a complex and often overlooked story, one that we will explore today. For Japan, the interwar period was fraught with the same anxieties felt by countries all over the world. The Great Depression had effectively crippled the economy with the collapse of world trade and ineffective countermeasures, sparking criticism from those who opposed a liberal capitalist system. This led to rising influence within Japan's far-right circles, most importantly, the military, who, by 1931, had instigated the Mukden Incident, a false flag event that enabled Japan's Kuomintang army under General Shigeru Honjo to seize all of Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, which provided resources for the home islands and acted as a bulwark against the Soviet Far East, which loomed ominously on the northern border. Shocked by the military's insubordination, Japan's civilian government felt powerless to challenge the rapid victories gained from their conquest, which only empowered the military further. By 1936, a series of assassinations and coup d'etat plots had been carried out by extremist elements known as the Young Officers. Their reign of terror helped embolden the influence of military staff within the Japanese cabinet, and ultimately gained support for further military actions in China. Japan's signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact in November also secured the nation for their eventual conflict with the Soviet Union, and notably, the pact changed Germany's Far East Asian policy, which dropped support for China in favor of Japan. While border skirmishes tested the mettle of communist sovereignty in the north, a new front was opened further south in July 1937, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, as ground forces from Japan's China Garrison Army poured into the Peking Tianjin region of China. This incursion would escalate full-scale into the Second Sino-Japanese War, or in Japanese, simply, the China Incident. As Chinese cities were decimated and pillaged, Japanese relations with the West worsened significantly. The West broadly condemned the atrocities committed by the Japanese military on Chinese civilians, in an occupation they had first deemed illegal since the invasion of Manchuria. Along with the rising embargoes from the West, the Japanese army also suffered a humiliating defeat at Kochin-Gol in September 1939, when the invading Japanese Sixth Army was defeated in a series of pitched battles by the Soviet Red Army. Despite this loss, Germany's invasion of Poland looked like an opportunity to establish a new order in East Asia for the Japanese. A broadcast on June 29, 1940, by Foreign Minister Arita Hashiro, advocated for the inclusion of various South Seas areas, later developing into the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. As Germany conquered Europe, Japan set about acquiring the territories necessary for their co-prosperity. Beyond their gains in China, Japan incorporated French Indochina with German consent on September 22, 1940. Occupying the former colonies until the Vichy French authorities bowed to the Japanese demands. 4 days later, the next day, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, concluding a defensive alliance with Germany and Italy against the United States, who, by this time, had sought to cripple Japan's war effort with harsh sanctions and embargoes on much-needed resources like machine tools, aviation fuel, and scrap metal. The need for these resources, coupled with fears of an eventual oil embargo, drove Japan further toward establishing their co-prosperity sphere, which was deemed vital for the ongoing war in China. At home, the Japanese public were galvanized into support of the empire through intense repression and propaganda. Anti-subversion laws and controls over the intelligentsia were implemented to discourage liberal tendencies. Education on all levels was revoked to indoctrinate the youth, shaping them as future assets for Japanese supremacy over Asia and the Pacific. Imperial propagandists incorporated Shinto religious traditions in this effort, forming a state-sanctioned cult which served the empire's interests first and foremost. Above all this, Hirohito reigned as the divine figurehead Emperor Showa. It was under his name that Japanese fighters dedicated their famous Banzai battle cry, charging recklessly into the enemy with bayonets, swords, or in the cockpit of a diving aircraft. Militarily, resources of the co-prosperity sphere would be secured under a national resource zone, which stretched from Burma to Melanesia. To protect this zone, the newly conquered territories would be defended by the army, while the navy secured its ocean lanes. This daunting task of naval superiority in the Pacific was made attainable thanks to Japan withdrawing from the Washington Naval Limitation Treaty in 1937. giving the Navy ample time to construct some of the largest battleships ever built, like the Thori, Yamato, and the Musashi. At the same time, senior staff held doubts about these super battleships, urging those in government to shift focus toward air power and submarines needed for the national defense zone. Of those senior staff, the most notable was its commander-in-chief, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was a longtime believer in naval aviation, something which played a key role in his plans for Operation Z, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Operation Z envisioned a preemptive strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet and her aircraft carriers, taking advantage of a delayed American response to quickly invade and occupy all of the planned southern resource zones. With these natural resources secured and the Americans so suddenly brutalized, it was believed that the Allies would leave Japan dominant over the Pacific. However, inter-service tensions brewed over priorities of the war. The Army remained adamant on the Chinese theater and pushed to seize natural resources in the areas north of Manchuria. The Navy instead advocated for the new South Sea areas, and with the Army's loss of favor after Kokyo Gol, the Navy was given their opportunity. Want to keep up with community events and discussions? Check out our Discord server today. On December 7th, 1941, combined elements of Japan's First Air Fleet attacked without a declaration of war. 350 aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor and military bases on Oahu, with the U.S. Navy losing 4 battleships, 188 aircraft, and 2,400 sailors over the next 4 hours. The Japanese Navy only lost 29 aircraft and 55 pilots. Soon after, Japan invaded the Philippines, Singapore, and the rest of Southeast Asia with little resistance from the Allied nations. The surprise nature of these invasions succeeded thanks to the competence of Japanese commanders, with examples like the Malay operation under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, seeing the entire peninsula captured by the 25th Army in a blitzkrieg assault. That lasted only 70 days. On the home front, a mixture of excitement and anxiety lingered among the public. No lantern parades rang out like after the capture of Nanking. Instead, the Japanese expressed resolve in the face of a waking giant. For Admiral Yamamoto, there was a great concern for the U.S. aircraft carriers, which had avoided destruction at Pearl Harbor. This fear proved to be well-founded after the USS Hornet penetrated the Western Pacific without alerting Japanese patrols and successfully launched a carrier strike over Tokyo in what became known as the Doolittle Raid. In response, the Army launched Operation Seigo, ravaging the Zhejiang-Jiangxi region in China in search of the American airmen who had taken shelter there after the raid. A month later, the Port Moresby operation was foiled after a strategic withdrawal following the Battle of the Coral Sea, which marked the first time Japan's Navy had been stopped in its tracks. Yamamoto was well aware of America's potential for total retaliation and sought to turn the tide by establishing a new base of operations to renew their attacks on U.S. bases in Hawaii. For this, the Admiral first wished to trap the U.S. Navy's remaining Pacific Fleet carriers and battleships at Midway Atoll, then establish bases in the Aleutian Islands to prevent the U.S. from conducting strategic bombing raids across the northern Pacific. The resources required to capture the Aleutians diverted assets away from the attack at Midway, with the surprise element becoming undone by U.S. intelligence, who broke Japanese naval codes and hatched their own plans in preparation for the foreign plans in preparation. Confrontation. Over the 4th to the 7th of June, the Battle of Midway saw Japan's 4 premier aircraft carriers and a heavy cruiser destroyed, along with the loss of 248 aircraft and the deaths of 3,057 personnel. From his flagship, Admiral Mitome Ugaki recorded, "The tables had turned entirely, and we are now forced to do our utmost to cope with the worst case. This should be kept in mind as a lesson showing that war is not predictable. Despite the defeat at Midway, inter-service rivalries once again reared its ugly head as the Army was misled about the battle's aftermath. Due to this, the Army continued to believe for a short while that the fleet was in good condition. For the enemy, however, these recent victories had given them the confidence and momentum needed to begin their island-hopping campaign. Japanese military leadership were aware that their forces were not adjusting quickly enough to fit the new demands of combat. Attempts to update their arsenal in 1942 were unsuccessful, as the majority of weapons remained unchanged due to a lack of resources. The Army's focus shifted to securing occupied territories and controlling a widely dispersed military. With the rush to produce equipment, there was little time for quality control, integration of improvements, or improved packaging. The Japanese faced many material shortages, which forced them to prioritize production for aircraft and ships at the cost of other much-needed armaments. But even this was not enough. In late 1942, Allied landings in Guadalcanal left the Japanese isolated into pockets of resistance, allowing the Allies to bypass them for bigger targets. Over 1943, the Japanese defense of the occupied Gilbert and Marshall Islands was marked by fierce fighting on both land and sea, with the Japanese suffering heavy losses due to the superior firepower of the Allied forces. By 1944, the Japanese Navy had lost naval superiority after a crushing defeat in June during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, characterized as the largest carrier-to-carrier battle in history. The lack of Japanese fire support was detrimental to their defense of the Mariana and Palau Islands, where the Japanese suffered heavy losses because of the American superior firepower and the strategic bombing campaign. While the North China Area Army, under General Akamura Yatsutsuga, thundered across China amid Operation Ichigo, General Yamashita's defense of the occupied Philippines was crippled by another naval defeat at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the First Sea organized use of kamikaze attacks did little to sway the tide. Japan's fighting spirit remained tenacious, with the Americans forced to contend with displays like that of General Yoshitsugu Saito's 4,300-man banzai charge during the Battle of Saipan, a ferocious assault which decimated the American 105th Infantry Regiment at the cost of nearly all of its attackers. Despite their losses, both the Army and Navy made it clear that the Americans would have to fight both tooth and nail for every island occupied by Japanese forces. The rising failures of late 1944 to 1945 highlighted the military's desperate situation. Island-hopping campaigns ground away Japanese garrisons, leaving many abandoned to an honorable death, like that of General Tadamichi Kurabayashi at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Offensive campaigns such as Operation Yugo petered out before they even began, due to the severe lack of resources. 1945 marked the final turning point, as March saw the U.S. launch a firebombing campaign across Tokyo, devastating the city's industrial capacity and leaving a death toll of 80,000 to nearly 100,000 people. With the Allied forces closing in, Japan found itself using all means necessary to defend the home islands. During the U.S. invasion of Okinawa in June, over 100,000 troops were stationed to defend the island, inflicting some of the heaviest American casualties of the entire war, which also came at a huge cost to the Japanese and Okinawan conscripts. Some estimates claim that up to half of the island's population was killed, forced to commit suicide, or otherwise disappeared during the battle. Meanwhile, Japan's Second Fleet was thrown at the Allies in a suicidal attack known as Operation Tango, which promptly failed after having their naval codes once again decrypted by U.S. intelligence. Despite a barrage of kamikaze attacks, the U.S. Fifth Fleet had sunk the Yamato and 5 of the other 9 ships present at the battle. The writing was on the wall. Allied forces called for the unconditional surrender of Japan at the Potsdam Conference on the 26th of July, 1945, threatening refusal with prompt and utter destruction. Japan's government ignored the Allies' ultimatum, leading to the decision by the United States, with agreement from the United Kingdom, to use the newly created atomic bombs again. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, respectively, leaving a collective death toll estimated to have killed hundreds of thousands, both from the immediate detonation and radiation poisoning in the far weeks and months after. Following the bombing of Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war, driving into Manchuria after the bombing of Nagasaki. Still, Japan seemed only on August 15th, after the unfamiliar voice of the emperor called out for peace, did the war end.